This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Bruce Usher. Bruce is a professor at the Columbia Business School in New York City. He's also an entrepreneur before he went down the academic path. Today, we jump into perhaps the most controversial issue facing humanity today, climate change. Bruce's new book is called Investing in the Era of Climate Change. No big lead up here. Let's jump right into the deep end of the pool. You can probably guess it's going to be interesting. And you know what? To me, it was interesting. Where do we end up? You'll just have to tune in and check that out. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Bruce Usher. This is after I think 1,100 episodes on this podcast and all kinds of subjects, started off as a trading podcast to parallel my books, but has morphed into every subject under the sun, and probably many academic peers that perhaps you even know have appeared on the show.
I saw that. Very impressive. Yeah.
Well, so here's my thing, is that this has been a topic that has come up many times. I've often avoided it. In fact, this might be the first time that I've brought this topic onto the podcast. I think one of the reasons I did, though, okay, I can see your book and I've got some perspectives about where you come from. The fact that you acknowledged that it was controversial at least made me think, well, okay, we've got something to work with here, right? This could be interesting in that sense, because of course it is controversial, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think there's a number of layers to that controversy. It's interesting you say you've been doing this show for a while, and this is the first time you look at this topic. That doesn't surprise me. I'll tell you why. I got involved with investing in climate change 20 years ago. In 2002, I became CEO of a little company called EcoSecurity. We grew that into the world's largest carbon credit company. It's quite large, went public, and eventually got taken over by JP Morgan in 2009. And I subsequently became an academic. That's another story. The point is, I've worked on this for 20 years. 20 years ago, the science of climate change was already pretty clear. The science is relatively straightforward. The issue had already been well identified. The problem was that there was actually very little that we could do about it. There wasn't really much to invest in. If you looked at solar back then, I sort of dug into it. I remember reading the first reports on solar. I thought to myself, this is a joke. This will never replace fossil fuels. It's incredibly expensive, tiny. Electric vehicles basically didn't exist. You could buy a golf cart. There wasn't very much to invest in. And what there was to invest in, they weren't competitive products with what was already out there. Fast forward 20 years to today, we're in a dramatically different situation, by which I mean renewable energy, wind and solar are in many cases the cheapest source of power available. Electric vehicles, I don't have to tell you about Tesla and the like. These are becoming the most popular cars out there for performance reasons, if nothing else. We have a whole slew of other low carbon solutions. There's now a lot to invest in. That's a very different situation than when I got involved 20 years ago.
Well, let me take it back. You laid down some things that I'm sure, as you know, some of the audience would at least like to be persuaded, or perhaps they want to be skeptical. Perhaps they want to apply the scientific method from their own perspective. I think it is an interesting issue, if we could maybe talk about this for a moment, is that the political nature of climate change is unusual to me. For the reason, it's unusual because I don't think anybody wants dirty air, dirty water. Even if we were to get down to the nitty gritty, for all I know, we could find out that the people that oppose climate change politics produce less bad things for the environment than the people that support it. I have no idea.
Sure. I fly a lot.
Yeah. So the thing is, today, I've got plenty of liberal friends. I got plenty of conservative friends. My conservative friends, I probably grew up more conservative. I don't know where I am today. I mean, I'm calling you, by the way, from Southeast Asia. I live in Saigon.
Oh, you're in Saigon. Okay. I was wondering where you were in Asia. I spent 4 years in Tokyo many, many years ago.
But, so it's just something where I say to myself, If a conservative person in America offers a question or an opinion or anything about the subject of what was once called global warming, shifted to climate change, which, of course, causes some skeptics to immediately raise the red flag and say, what's going on? Why do we need a marketing change? But the fact that a lot of conservative folks that don't want bad air, they don't want bad water, if they ask any questions, this has become so hyper partisan, so hyper political. It makes me wonder if anything will ever get done, really. And I'm going to get into some of the examples that you brought up a second ago. I was just bringing this up from a big picture philosophical perspective.
First of all, let me say I have the same worry. In other words, I'll ask the question, will we address climate change? Which really means, will we avoid catastrophic climate change, which is a warming of 2 degrees? Obviously, climate's going to change a bit. The answer, from my perspective, is we can. We can because we have these new products, these new technologies. If you start sort of adding up the impact of those technologies, we're already about halfway there to reducing what we need to do. And the other half is well in development. We have the capital to do that. If you sort of look at capital flows and what's possible, that capital is absolutely available. The challenge is the lack of political will. Can we address climate change? Sure, we can. I don't know that we will. The reason why you need political will here is this is not an individual problem. If I ride my bike and stop flying, you do the same, it's not going to make any difference. It's a global problem. That presents a real political challenge. We call this the tragedy of the commons, this kind of problem where a group of individuals is sharing a common area. Because when we each do what's in our best interest, the commons as a whole is degraded. So we all suffer. That's not because we don't understand. I think people understand very well. If you put enough pollution in the air, it's going to hurt everybody. Because if I stop and nobody else stops, I'm the loser. Why would I do that? Now we're not just talking about you and me or my local community in New York or even all Americans. We're talking about everyone. That is really hard to get political support behind because at the end of the day, the changes that are coming, these economic changes where we decarbonize industries and reduce emissions, which are coming, like any change in the economy, there's going to be winners and losers.
Well, I mean, arguably, a lot of people might say right now, the people that might be losing might just be a lot of people, because if we immediately said we were going from gas, diesel to renewables, we couldn't do it today, could we?
We couldn't do it. I mean, we can't go to zero today. To your point, the people who would probably suffer the most, in many cases, those who are most vulnerable, those who have the least ability to invest in renewables on their home. They may barely be able to afford diesel. They may be poorest parts of the world living on just a little bit each day. No, it would be impossible to do zero. Now, here's the thing. We don't have to go to zero today. The scientists, who I happen to believe in the science, they tell us we have to get there somewhere between 2050 and 2070. People are pretty freaked out about that because after 300 years of building our global economy based on emitting fossil fuels, we've got about 30 to 50 years to get that back to zero. That's not actually nothing. In other words, 30 to 50 years, there's absolutely a path to doing that is realistic both technologically and economically. That doesn't mean we will, but we could do it. Absolutely.
Let me take it back to something you brought up at the beginning, the electric cars. I believe it's 5% new cars are electric today. In the abstract, I guess if all of a sudden we could have everyone with an electric vehicle, that would be great. To get to an electric vehicle, I'm curious, and I frankly don't know the exact cost. I do know that batteries require a lot of energy that comes from fossil fuels, I'm guessing. There's a lot of digging and mining that has to take place. Just for the construction of cars, that has to use fossil fuel energy. Speak to where we are in terms of okay, here I am in this big city, right? If I could imagine the next day that every car was electric with no cost, that'd be pretty cool. What is the cost? Because batteries don't just come from the heavens with zero cost, correct?
Minerals that go into batteries, begin with lithium, have a cost. So the planet is abundant with lithium. It's just a question of opening up more resources, more mines. Batteries currently today mostly include cobalt and nickel, which are much more rare, particularly cobalt. What's occurring, and this is what you would expect to occur, is that as resources become constrained, because, for example, there's enormous demand for cobalt because of the growth in electric vehicles. Engineers are busy finding alternatives. In fact, Tesla's newest batteries, they're quite secretive about this, do not apparently require any cobalt. They're using a different formulation. This is what you expect.
It takes energy to mine the metals for the batteries. It takes energy to make the cars. Are there currently any renewables, I don't know the right terminology, net energy positive? I mean, for a windmill, for example, we have to make it, we have to build it. There's a lot of carbon-based energy there. Then when it's finished its useful life, it's going to go to a landfill somewhere.
Solar and wind are highly net energy positive. Solar in particular, for the simple reason that the PV panels last a very long time. They degrade very slowly, about 0.5% a year. The amount of energy required to make them is relatively low. Silicon is not that energy intensive. You brought up a different point, though, which I think is a really interesting point, which is, well, wait a minute. Let's say everybody starts driving electric vehicles. You imagine that for a second. If the electricity they use is produced using fossil fuels, coal and gas, how have we solved the problem? The answer to that is twofold. The electric motor is 3 times as efficient as an internal combustion engine. Internal combustion engine is an amazing machine we built. At the end of the day, it's a relatively inefficient machine because it uses heat as power. The gasoline explodes in your cylinder and that heat is converted to mechanical power. And that's relatively inefficient, whereas the electric motor is approximately 3 times as efficient. Let's assume we don't change our source of energy, our source of electricity whatsoever. We're still burning coal, natural gas, putting the electricity into the grid, and then use electricity to power our electric vehicles now instead of driving internal combustion engines. We would still reduce energy use, therefore reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 2/3, even without changing the grid at all.
I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea conceptually. Okay, efficient electrical engine. The energy storage on that device had to come from somewhere, had to be developed in some way, has a cost. I think that's the part that's a little amorphous for me.
It's not necessarily any more costly than building that internal combustion engine, which is a far more complex engine. You need transmissions, you need catalytic converters, all sorts of things, far more parts in that car. In other words, I think what you're getting at is building a car is a polluting activity. No question about that. I just want to go down this other path for a moment. There's an argument that's being made by some people that the only way to address climate change is what they call degrowth. We have to shrink our economy. We have to stop having children. This is the way we get out of this. I completely disagree.
That's an interesting point that you bring up. For sure, there are people out there, hardcore people that are saying, stop the kids, decrease the population. You're not on that side.
I'm not on that side. In fact, just to be absolutely clear, I don't think anyone who denies climate change is helpful in this situation, because I do believe the science is very clear. There's a lot of discussion about what to do about it, and that's what we're talking about, cars and the like. To me, the science of climate change is very clear. Equally, the argument that's being made by some people that there's nothing we can do about it. So some people would say the science, climate change is not, we don't need to worry about it. No, we need to worry about it. We need to do something about it. Equally, people who say they're so worried about it, it's hopeless. There's nothing we can do about it, to me, are equally problematic because they're also just throwing up their hands doing nothing. This is not the way to address this problem because you can't degrowth out of it. The only way to degrowth is we end humanity. You can't shrink our way to zero. We have to get to zero, by the way. That's where we need to head. First of all, we can't do it. Secondly, it would be wildly unfair to the 89% of the world's population who haven't enjoyed the benefits of economic growth through the industrial and agricultural revolution, or have only partially enjoyed it. It's one thing for me to sit here in New York City and say, oh, I could do it a little less. That's because we've enjoyed centuries of wonderful growth here, even if I wanted to. The developing world is not going to accept degrowth. They need economic growth. The third reason is because, in fact, you don't have to have degrowth. One of the things that people aren't aware of is that many countries today, particularly in Europe, UK and Germany, even in the US, have for more than a decade now, some cases, Germany and UK for 3 decades, significantly decarbonized their economies and had very strong economic growth. US greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2007. We've grown the economy dramatically since then. Population's grown too, per capita basis. There's plenty of evidence that these two things can be done together. In other words, we continue to improve our economies, improve our standard of living, and emit less greenhouse gases.
Let me ask a fun, slightly controversial question. So you mentioned that the climate science is agreed upon. I can go look around and I can find very learned people that are probably respected that might disagree with that statement. Let me keep it at the big picture issue of trying to persuade John Q. Public. Here's an example that I think causes John Q. Public to be like, I don't trust those folks. The example is this. The former president of America, President Obama, bought a grand estate on Martha's Vineyard for a significant sum of money, oceanfront. I think the average person, before they even get into the detail that you understand, the average person says, well, hold on here. He's a really smart guy. He wants to make an investment, buying this waterfront property in the face of rising sea levels. I think the imagery of that causes a lot of people, as you said earlier about flying, you always hear this in the headlines. A lot of the folks that are at the elite levels of talking about these political issues are jetting around the world on private jets. How do you address to the average person who doesn't have your level of understanding? They hear rising sea levels, and then they say, well, hold on. One of the smartest guys in America is buying this waterfront property. He surely wants to endow it to his kids who want to endow it to their kids, and they want to keep it in the family. Seems like a big risk to spend that amount of money. Do you see how the imagery of that can cause people to not want to be on your side?
It's an interesting example. The reason I say that is, I don't know where Obama's house is on Martha's Vineyard, but I've been to Martha's Vineyard. I would certainly buy property at Martha's Vineyard because it's very hilly.
I mean, he's oceanfront, so I've seen the pictures, yeah.
But you can be right on the ocean, like Edgartown's right on the water. It's a couple hundred feet up. So the land goes straight up. It's like saying, maybe people are more familiar with Hawaii. Hawaii is not going to be underwater.
Then you know what? Let's use examples all around the world. You and I know there's very astute, learned, wealthy folks all around the world, whether it's Bali or whether it's somewhere in the South Pacific, whether it's Martha's Vineyard, whether it's Miami. There are people all around the world investing in waterfront property. The average person is saying, well, hold on, why are they not afraid of rising sea levels?
The point you're getting at is a really interesting one, actually, which is around the issue of why do people no longer trust government? The evidence is that people no longer trust government. I was looking at this just yesterday, at Edelman surveys, which survey trust, and they're global surveys. In other words, not just the U.S. They ask people questions around essentially, do they trust government? Do they trust business? Do they trust nonprofits, religious institutions, and so on? By far, people now trust business leaders far more than they do government leaders. It's not that trust in business has necessarily gone up that much. It's that trust in government has dramatically fallen. This is not just a conservative liberal thing. This is across the board. I can't speak to why that is. That's not my area of expertise. Whether it's climate change and government response to that, or government response to COVID, or anything else, people are not believing what government leaders are. And the government leaders are usually basing it on science. I'll give you an example from the other perspective. In other words, where I think as a generalization, liberals are not listening, and that's around the issue of GMO food. There is a lot of scientific support for the fact that GMO food is completely safe for the environment, safe for you as a consumer. There are many people on the liberal side who are very anti-GMO. In Europe, there's very, very strong anti-GMO movement. For whatever reason, there's a group of people who distrust the science on climate and other issues. It tends to be the other way around. This is a huge problem. From my perspective, all I can say is, for me, the science is so. On climate change, I happen to believe the science. I've looked at the science. I'm not a scientist. I'm not sure I know much more than anyone else about this as the average person. I do trust what I've read about that. Now, I also happen to believe a lot of other science too, medical science and others.
When you say the science is settled, you mean the measurements over a certain period of the Industrial Revolution, those measurements as analyzed by a consensus of scientists. That's what you're talking about, correct?
Well, actually, I would say more than that. There's virtually no controversy around how much greenhouse gases is in the atmosphere and how much is added each year, where that comes from, because that's a very easy measurement. It's very simple. The reality is that if we didn't have any greenhouse gas in the atmosphere whatsoever, going back to pre-industrial times, we wouldn't be here. It would be a very cold planet. The greenhouse effect, the emissions of greenhouse gases, is pretty well understood. Where dispute lies it's certainly reasonable to say that we don't know for certain, is what the implications are going forward. In other words, if we keep emitting at the current rate, or we increase or we decrease, what does that look like 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now?
Almost impossible to tell 100 years from now. We're all kind of throwing darts at that stage of the game, aren't we?
Well, you and I will be around. I can tell you that.
There's not many examples in the last couple hundred years of people really making correct predictions, just about anything.
No, when it comes to physics, and this is just physics, that's all it is. This is not a socioeconomic forecast. For example, economics, good luck forecasting economics. I think you and I know, or good luck forecasting the markets or anything like this. This is physics. Will we have gravity 100 years from now? Pretty confident of that. We can certainly get very good predictions based on what greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere at that point in time. That's not terribly controversial. What that means for those living here, that's much harder to say. Let's just say the world warms 3 to 5 degrees, which would be a great deal. Some regions you'd have 15 or 20 degrees warm. That's in Celsius. The world would look very different. Would that mean it would be a horrible place? Not necessarily. I'm from Canada originally. Winters are long and cold. Canada might have some benefits from this. They have some challenges too. There'll be all sorts of changes. Same, by the way, for Russia. Interesting statistic I read not that long ago, before the war in Ukraine. Russia apparently was exporting more food than weapons. It was earning more revenue from exporting food than weapons for the first time ever. And that's partly to do with the warming that has increased the amount of agricultural land in Russia. In other words, we can predict the physics of climate change, get a pretty good sense of how average temperatures will change. But, no one lives the average. Depending on where you live and what you're doing, you actually could see beneficial changes, perhaps.
Let me keep bouncing you around. I think it's the full picture. This is my style, to take around and dig and dive. I mean, look, you could tell. I could probably pick your mind for quite a while here, Let me take it back to renewables for a moment, because this is very topical. This just happened in the state of California. And this, again, gets to one of the things, I don't have many notes in front of me, but one of the biggest notes I had was no trust. We have a situation where California has come out and said, hey, no more gas cars, I don't know, by 2030 or 2050, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Also, in the last just couple of weeks, it's like, okay, no, you can't charge your car now. And I think this was in Colorado, the home thermostats were regulated. This takes our whole conversation up to another level, because ultimately, for us American types especially, the freedom thing just disappears at that moment in time. Because here you are, you're being a good soldier, so to speak, not you, but just anybody. You got your Tesla. Then all of a sudden the government says, can't charge it today. Or, sorry, no air conditioning today. This, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm like, wow, this is not the kind of system that I like. The power to regulate the individual is now in the hands of the bureaucrats, which is, I don't have any other word for that except frightening.
What's interesting about solar in particular, why do people like solar? Some people like solar because of the environmental benefits. That's a really small sliver of the population. That's probably like 1 or 2%. People like solar for 2 reasons. The number one reason by far is because it's cheaper. People don't know where electricity's coming out of your plug. You can't tell where those electrons come from. Just say, I can give you the same electrons. It's going to cost less. People sign up for that. They like that. There's another, ultimately, more fundamental reason why people like solar. Because in fact, it allows them to do the exact opposite of what you just said. It allows you to control your own supply of energy, your own power.
Assuming the sun is on.
Well, if the sun turns off, you're for good. We're finished. You and I don't have to worry about too much at that point. We're done. We're done. The idea of having solar panels, of course, you need energy storage for the evening. You can now get that pretty cheaply. That has a lot of appeal, particularly for Americans. And I'll give you an example. California, a housing builder, I don't recall the name, one of the big housing builders here in the U.S., they are building a project and they apply to the government in California to make the project entirely off-grid. All the houses in this community they're building, they'll generate their own source of power and have their own batteries and store it. Under California law, you need permission to do that. You have to be on the grid. Back to your point about bureaucrats having control. Hopefully they'll get that approval. I don't know if they will or not. But the point is, this is appealing. This home builder, it's a for-profit builder. They're not doing this for environmental reasons. They're doing it because their customers are going to really like this. It's a feeling of freedom, self-control. You get to save money. I want to make another point here because I think it touches on what you're saying. Where's the role of government in all this? And I started off earlier saying trust in government's very low. This is a challenge, and we have this tragedy of commons, and we need countries to cooperate to address climate change. But I also started off earlier saying that this is an interesting moment for climate change and investors because we now have all these products that we didn't have before. We have these competitive technologies, and they're really appealing. That's the point I want to make. We're almost at the point where instead of we need government to make this happen, in some scenarios, we need government just to get out of the way to make it happen.
Well, now come on now. That is some wishful thinking for the American government in particular, at whatever level, town, county, state, federal, to get out of the way. Oof, I would love that too, but I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon.
It is wishful thinking, but here's my point. My point is the economy is going to change. It is changing. We're moving from fossil fuels to renewables, primarily because it's cheaper. We're moving to electric cars and so on. In order for that transition to happen, a lot of stuff has to get built. You have to build cars, build solar, build wind, build transmission lines, build charging, build all this sort of stuff. Building stuff in America is really hard to do. It's really hard to do because the regulatory environment is really challenging. That is a concern I have. Actually, in fact, I recently wrote an op-ed about it in The Hill on exactly that point. Just we have to change this thicket of regulations out there just so we can build more stuff faster.
But let me keep you with the issue for you personally. Let's assume you're a nice guy living in California, living in LA. You want to take a trip. The bureaucracy says, can't charge the Tesla today. Are you cool with that power being in the hand of somebody else?
I lived through the oil shortages of the 70s.
Hold on. We're in 2022. I'm asking you right now, today, would you be comfortable with not knowing the exact reasons, literally having your freedom changed in a way that has not happened since the introduction of the automobile in America? I mean, that's quite a significant change to say you can't take your car out today. The government is just doing it. You don't really know the logic of why they're doing it.
Well, first of all, I'd say no one has stopped anyone from taking that car out. The government of California did ask people to reduce charging at certain times because they have these rolling blackouts. With, by the way, they're suffering the worst heat ever. They are really in a bad way from a heat perspective, which has nothing to do with government. It has to do with the temperature, the weather. I don't worry about anyone telling me I can't charge my car.
Okay, fair enough. We can be respectfully very disagreeing about that particular issue. Let me shift you into something, though, that I think is a really important issue in this issue of climate change and energy. A few years ago, about 10 now, I was living in Southern California, San Diego. A few miles north of San Diego, there were some nuclear reactors that powered a lot of Southern California on the coast there, a little north of San Diego. I can't remember the exact name. They shut those down. I think there was a problem. Well, you and I know there has not been new nuclear power stations have not been created in America for a very, very long time. I believe Mr. Bill Gates, would be one of the proponents. There's been, from my understanding, a lot of, and you're going to be a guy that can correct me or tell me I'm wrong or buttress my point, but there's been a lot of developments in nuclear energy, nuclear protection, all kinds of different reactor technologies that have nothing to do with our memories of 3 Mile Island and all that kind of stuff. Is that a fair assessment on nuclear today?
I read about nuclear a bit in the book. You're absolutely right. There's been very little development in nuclear. There actually is one nuclear facility with 2 plants under development in Georgia. It's the only one at the moment being built in America. They've been building it for, I believe, more than a decade at this point. It's massively over budget. Why are we not building nuclear? Well, some people say it's the fears of 3 Mile Island and anything like that. That's actually not the reason. We're not building nuclear because it's a really expensive source of power. Well, you can get power much more cheaply from natural gas or renewables or coal, although coal's less cheap than it was. It doesn't make any sense to build nuclear today at the current price point. That being said, you're absolutely right. There are some very interesting new developments in nuclear. They take 2 forms. One is fusion, which I am sanguine about it. There's been optimism about fusion ever since the 1940s. Hard to believe that that's really going to get commercial anytime soon. There's a lot of optimism around what's called small modular reactors, or SMR. That's what Bill Gates has been financing. A number of venture capitalists have been backing SMRs recently. They're smaller than a traditional nuclear reactor, which is very helpful because you can make them more distributed, put it where the power is needed. They do not generate nuclear waste, or a very small amount, if any. They're much safer. Most importantly, it looks like they might turn out to be much cheaper than traditional nuclear. I say looks like because none of them are at commercial scale yet. There are some pilot plants being developed today. If in fact SMR nuclear turns out to live up to its promise of being an inexpensive, flexible source of power, we should be building a lot of these. And in fact, that's what Gates is betting on. He thinks we will be building a lot of these nuclear plants in the future. I think that's terrific. I think nuclear is an important part of the solution to climate change if we can get the price down.
You're teaching at Columbia, correct?
Columbia Business School, yeah.
You might have seen the interesting headline recently about free speech in Columbia. You guys got a really bad ranking. I think you were dead last. My question for you as a professor, when you're dealing with students, are students, when these types of topics come up, are they coming at you with the probing, skeptical push that I'm throwing at you, forcing you to defend it all? Or are students essentially just saying, I agree, I'll do anything?
Well, I teach business school students. It's one of the top business schools in the country, if not the world. The students are very realistic, very practical, very smart, very ambitious. I have never had an experience in the classroom of students being uncomfortable with different points of view or asking smart questions. I actually love teaching mostly because I learn from my students a great deal and I really enjoy this. I understand or have read that at the undergraduate level, there have been professors who've been uncomfortable in discussing certain topics. I've personally never experienced it.
Well, yeah. I mean, you told me at the beginning, you said, okay, I created this company. I sold it to, was it JP Morgan, I think?
Yeah.
Yes, I can understand and imagine some of your background that you're not going to completely relate as perhaps an academic that has been in the system forever. You can appreciate that look, there's probably some people that would say the questions I'm asking or some of the perspectives that I'm taking, even if I'm not even trying to say I believe this or I believe that, just to get you to put forward your views, there is a significant amount of censorship taking place.
I think the lack of dialogue on any issue today is a problem. I think we should all, not just you and I, Michael, but I think everybody, I think we'd all be better off if we talked, whether it was climate change or any of these other so-called controversial issues. I think we'd all be better off by having more conversation. I am an immigrant to America in the sense that I came from Canada. Not only may it not be that different a country, but it is a different country. I came here by choice. And I'm a big believer in America. I think this is an incredible country. I do worry about our increasing divide in this country, our inability to sort of talk through these issues, find some area of common ground. It's not a good spot to be in that we have these sort of disagreements.
Let me give an example also from the world at large today. You mentioned it in your book as well, the idea of ESG. The thing that I find interesting about this, we've talked about a lot of the environmental issues. The thing that I find so interesting about ESG, again, the lack of trust for some people, is, okay, I understand the idea that if we were to find a way that corporations could be more, quote, environmentally friendly, people might have disagreements about how to get there, how to measure it, all that kind of stuff. Conceptually, that seems okay. The part that seems unusual to me is where where you take and include, for example, into something like an environmental focus, then you have something like a social focus. I brought this example up many times on this podcast, and you would know this as a professor. The Asian kids across the world, if the Ivy Leagues were going on merit, they would win. The part that strikes me unusual about, okay, we have this idea of corporations getting them to be more environmentally friendly, all the definitions that go behind that. Then we kind of wrap it in with these other things like the social part, where then again, it's like somebody behind the scenes is picking the slots and picking the players. For me personally, as someone who's lived in Asia for 10 years, once the focus goes away from merit to diversity, usually only diversity in the context of how America sees diversity, I'm not happy about that. Because I think this is where we get these problems where, yes, everybody wants clean water, everybody wants clean air. Then all of a sudden, things get combined and people are like, man, I don't trust any of these guys.
I mean, I think it's two separate issues. The one is sort of academic, the merit issue, and I don't have any expertise on that topic. The issue of ESG is an interesting one. It's interesting, first of all, that's become a political issue because I find that kind of laughable. To me, it has very little to do with politics. It's been politicized.
The social part, I mean, if you take 50% of America, the conservative side, and said, read the social definitions, I was just reading the CFA analysis of the ESG before this conversation. I think 50% of America would immediately say, well, that's just left politics. I don't think anybody on the right would say that's anything but that.
Well, the question is, why does a company focus, say, on reducing its greenhouse gas emissions? So let's just take that for a moment.
Well, I think we can agree with that. I mean, that's the part that we've already had that long conversation where I would think, yes, we don't want companies to be dumping whatever they're dumping into the freaking Mississippi.
Okay, so let's take the S then, which not my area of expertise, but let's take the S for saying, why would a company say we're going to have a policy that allows people we're going to support their social cause? Well, they do it because their customers and their employees want them to. They're really meeting the demands of their customers and their employees. And a lot of customers want this, and a lot of employees want this, or they don't do it. And so while a company that has a certain group of customers and employees might have certain social policies, another one will have slightly different social policies. As long as they're within the letter of the law, of course, I don't see why that's so strange or so unusual. And companies have been doing this for years. They've had internal policies on how they do things, and not all companies are the same. We wouldn't expect them to be the same.
Well, I guess I could wrap that analysis up with go woke or go broke.
I'm not sure what that means.
Well, I mean, listen, in the last handful of years, you and I are old enough to know that corporate America has gotten very political on all kinds of issues. There's issues that have differences of opinions down the middle of the aisle. I don't think it's unusual to say that.
I think that's true. I think they become much more political. I don't think they necessarily want to be political. I don't think every CEO is like, geez, I'm excited to make a statement about X or Y, knowing that it's controversial or political. I think they're being pushed to do so in many cases, again, by their consumers, by their employees. And that's partly they're being pushed to do so because the point I made a few minutes ago, which is that people are no longer looking to government to address these sort of issues. They have social concerns or environmental concerns. Historically, when you and I were younger, people did look to the government, say, look, you guys got to fix this. You guys got to address this and regulate it, or whatever the case may be. People don't do that anymore because they've given up on government. They look to business leaders to take stands. Now, do I think business leaders are thrilled about that? No. I think it puts them in a really difficult position. I mean, if you're a company that operates across America or globally for that matter, you're right. There's going to be a huge range of opinions on these matters, and you're going to be stuck in a very difficult place, sort of a no-win situation. That is the world we're in, and I completely agree with you.
Where does the idea of our hamburgers and steaks stand in all of this?
Yeah.
Where does that stand?
Yeah, I write about that a little bit. Use an example of Beyond Meat, all these meatless companies. From a climate perspective, it's a problem in the sense that the emissions from beef, we can get into that, are significant. To me, what's interesting about Beyond Meat and these other products, I've spoken several times to the founder of Beyond Meat. He's actually Columbia Business School grad. His position is very simple, which is people don't stop eating meat because you tell them it's bad for the environment. You come out with a better product. It's kind of the same as what Elon Musk did with Tesla and what others have done, what I call these climate solutions. Very, very few people who are going to change their consumer behavior because it's bad for climate change and the environment. That's not the way we solve this. We come out with better products. And better products, again, cheaper, say solar, or a more appealing product. He's like, my product, Beyond Meat, I'm going to sell it in the meat aisle. I'm going to sell it as it's a better product. He says it's better for your health and it tastes better. Look, I've eaten a bunch of their products. I happen to think their sausages taste really good. I really like them.
I've got my Beyond Meat throw-up bucket here right now. I can't go. Here's the thing also, though, too. You know something about evolution. Us Homo sapiens, the real driver when we shifted from one species to another really was meat.
Absolutely. And he acknowledges that. He's like, yeah, we are built on eating meat. But here's the thing. At some point, his product tastes and seems a lot like meat. Or maybe he doesn't say. I'm sort of on the fence about it myself. By the way, I enjoy a good steak. I can tell you that. Pork chops and everything else. Don't get me going on bacon, which is particularly fun.
Yes, I'm a bacon lover too, of course.
Yeah. Absolutely. His point is his product will keep getting better. So you look at what we eat today, and yeah, you can go back and say, well, look, there's very little that we eat today that is anything at all what a predecessor ate. Everything now is processed. It's very, very different. His product is yet another processed product. In fact, that's the argument that people make. It's not a pure product, that's for sure.
Are we going to reach a point, though, where the government steps in? I mean, the trend line to me sure looks like it's coming. If they can turn your house off, if they can turn your car off, they can sure as heck turn your meat off.
I don't think so. I'm not worried about that.
But you're okay. So let's just make sure. I'm not picking on you. Okay, you're cool with if the government says you can't drive the Tesla today. You're cool with.
No. I didn't say that. I said I'm not worried about that. I don't think the government's going to do that.
Okay, but isn't that what's been happening in California right now?
No, they asked people to turn down the air conditioning and not drive because the power grid there is in a really bad way. It's in a bad way because of this massive heat wave.
What I'm getting at is that it seems like it's a hop, skip, and a jump. It's not too far away, at least in my imagination, to where we would have those kinds of restrictions. If you disagree with me, that's fine. But you don't think those kinds of restrictions on, for example, driving your car or AC in your house or meat, you don't see those on the horizon at all?
No. I mean, I could see it, and I don't think it's going to happen. It's possible the government could tax your emissions of greenhouse gas of CO2. They could say, at the moment, you get to pollute for free. We all get to pollute for free in America. If you want to put CO2 other greenhouse gas in the air, there's no charge for that. At some point, I could see the government stepping in and saying, like other forms of pollution, if you do it, you got to pay for it. That would be what's called carbon tax or carbon cap. I don't think it's going to happen for political reasons. That's a whole different discussion. If they did that, there's nothing wrong with that from my perspective. In fact, I think it would be the right thing to do because we should pay for our actions. It wouldn't change things a great deal. I mean, if they tax $20 a ton for CO2, the average driver would pay $100 a year. We emit about 5 tons a year, which is pretty de minimis.
You know, you and I in this conversation, I hope you feel the same, even if we are arguing different points of view, similar points of view at various points in time. Civil, I think of the underlying part of the issues that we're talking about. I can't imagine a rosy scenario in the future. It just seems like the things that you and I are talking about, the issues that we're talking about, even though we're having kind of a civil academic back and forth type conversation, it sure seems like this is the foundation of major conflict.
That's a real worry for me. I agree. I think that this sort of partisan divide or social divides that are in the country and the inability for people to discuss them in a rational way, it is worrisome for me. When it comes to climate change, a little ironic, I would say, from my perspective. I'm not throwing out that word ironic lightly. What I mean is we have all sorts of challenges in our society. I mean, from the pandemic that we just went through to war in certain parts of the world, all sorts of other challenges. Climate change is just one of them. Climate change, however, from my perspective, is a relatively straightforward challenge. We know what the problem is, putting this stuff up in the atmosphere. We know how to reduce the problem. We have a path to doing so. We have lots of great products. To me, it's like one of those things where if we literally sat down in a room, let's just say there was just the two of us, there's no one else out there, and said, okay, we disagree on some of these things. Let's just figure out how we can find common ground and solve this problem together to the point where I'm happy, you're happy. Let's work this out. I think this is one of these things we could work out. We could figure it out together. And I think, to me, it's a bit ironic and really unfortunate that there is so little common ground, but people can't seem to find this common ground. It's getting worse.
I like the way that you present. I like the way that you debate, argue. I like the idea that you say that you think you and I could sit down if it's just the two of us and that we could find common ground. I think we could have another 6-hour conversation about why that's not true from my perspective. Because I think you understand immediately why I would say that. You're giving the optimistic perspective, saying, I hope we can find common ground. I'm being a little more pessimistic, looking at the trend line of disagreement. And I'm saying, when is there common ground going to appear? Because all I see is a divide that's getting wider and wider and wider.
That's why I'm worried about it. I agree. I'm a big believer in trends. I mean, that's obviously why I focus on things like climate change. It's all about trends. In your work, it's focused on trends. And yeah, the trend, it's not good. I think at heart, I'm hardwired for optimism. That's why I was an entrepreneur several times. Maybe I'm too optimistic. I don't know.
Well, good stuff, Bruce. People will have to dig in. You do get into, which a lot of things we did not get into the book today. You do get into different types of investments, a lot more detail. I wanted to get into some of these big picture issues to start. The book, for everybody that wants to check it out, Investing in the Era of Climate Change. So people can find that everywhere. Bruce, is there a website you might want to direct people to? Where can they find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. That's my favorite way for people to connect with me. They can reach out to me and find me there. They can also find me at the university. I'm obviously public at the business school. The book is available everywhere, of course, on Amazon, ebook or in print, as you wish.
You remind me as you say that about LinkedIn. I mean, I'm connected on LinkedIn. I have thousands of connections there. I find myself never going there. I feel like I'm in a parallel universe when you say that. I'm like, what am I missing? There's got to be something that I'm missing because this guy is in LinkedIn. I've got thousands of people connected to there, but I never log in at all. I must be doing something wrong.
Social media of choice, whatever platform you like.
Well, cool stuff. I appreciate you. As I said at the top, this is a little controversial. I appreciate you fielding all kinds of questions. I don't know what you expected today. Did I meet your expectations of controversy?
Oh, and I enjoyed this conversation. And it's a bit like a classroom because you ask me my students, I mentioned I learn from my students every time I teach. And literally every class I teach, I learn something. I usually learn the most when a student pushes back a little bit and asks a hard question or brings up a different perspective, different point of view. Again, I wish everybody was having these kind of conversations.
I agree. There's not enough of it. But Bruce, I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you very much.
Same here. Thank you very much. Take care.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.